Hello and welcome. Today's topic is going to be looking at personal and community stories of being autistic. A common experience, extremely common, I would say almost every late diagnosed or identified autistic adult has the experience of being asked, "How do you know you're autistic?" Or, "What do you mean you're autistic?" Um, and then, so that's kind of that external experience. And then there's, on the flip side, there's an internal experience, which is, what do I mean that I'm autistic? How do I know that I'm autistic? So there's almost two stories. For some people, the two stories are very similar. What we say to people when they ask us about being autistic is very similar to what we experience inside. For other people, what they tell others versus what they tell themselves may be very different. So you could have an autistic adult who doesn't tell people they're autistic. Maybe says, sometimes I'm on the spectrum, or I'm neurodivergent, or I think I might be autistic. There's and on the inside, maybe they know I'm 90% sure I'm autistic, or maybe they don't tell anyone, and there's just this inner journey that's happening, or they've been diagnosed by a professional, but have yet to figure out how to start, or if they want to start living in a way where they're out as an autistic person. And it's fine either way, right? Like, it's your identity as a possibly autistic person or an autistic person. You don't owe anyone an an explanation. I do think the journey of how we talk to ourselves is one that's worth looking at and re-looking at. And the second piece of what I'm going to talk about a lot today has to do with that. It has to do with how we talk to ourselves about being autistic. I'm recording this on my iPhone, and at this time I don't have the funds to like get a nice studio. So I'm hoping that you all can hear me, and maybe I can invest in a microphone in the future. But hopefully the content is what's important and you can hear me. What When we ask this question of like, how do I talk to myself about being autistic? What's my view of self and where I am in the journey? There can be a lot of what we call internalized ableism. So, internalized ableism can be like, ugh, why am I so wrong as a human or broken as a human? Why can't I go to a party without the sounds or the small talk or meeting new people bothering me? That might be an internalized ableism self thought, right? Another one could be, I'm not, I don't have the credentials, I'm not smart enough, or maybe not smart enough is the right one, but I don't have the credentials, or I don't know enough to feel secure in saying that I know that I am autistic. So there's this like so much self doubt. And then the last one that I think we're gonna really go into a lot today is this idea of what I'll call value relativism in autistic versus holistic society. Now, the concept that there is an autistic culture, or community that's large, um, that has common values, that's an idea that many of us in autistic advocacy have, but it's a feeling or a shared consciousness, and not every person is going to feel that they share autistic cultural values with every other autistic person, because, as we've said before, you've met one autistic, you've met one autistic. Um, and the same is going to be true with Aulistics, right? Not all Aulistics are going to share the same cultural values around neurodivergence, around looking at neurodivergence, or being aware of the diversity of neurodiversity. But today we will be talking about value relativism. And when I say that, what I mean is this idea like if you have two different cultures, and one culture believes that wearing shoes in the house is totally normal and it would be rude to come into somebody else's house and show your feet all over the floor, right? And then in another culture, it may be seen as rude to wear your shoes into somebody's house. And so there's an idea that values within cultures can be relative to the culture. Or another example might be in some cultures, a certain color would not be used at a certain time because it means death, right? Um, for example, I'm thinking of like wearing black to a wedding. Might in some Western, my culture, I'm American, like that might be considered bad. Um, and then there are other cultures where white is actually considered a color of death. So, and who's right? There's like it's relative to the culture. And yet, when we look at holistic, non autistic, versus autistic culture, where I live at least, and I think around the world in many ways, it depends on the culture, but there's an idea that the ways in which autistic people move through the world is wrong and bad and needs to be fixed, and the way holistic people move through the world is generally the norm, like the we talk about like a privileged knapsack, right? So then when we're talking about these things, sorry, I'm autistic and I'm hearing a sound, so I've got to go stop it and I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. That sound was going to bother me. I was giving myself some self-accommodation. Okay, so I was saying like with autistic cultures and ways of being in the world are often pathologized, but I think that it really brings a lot of self-accommodation and self-acceptance and I think peace to start looking as autistic people at the ways in which ourselves or others have applied kind of random views about what is okay and what is not okay for us to do. For example, eye contact. There's an idea in holistic culture that there's moral value or human value, communication value to eye contact. And I can tell you that I live my life as someone who makes very little eye contact, especially with people I don't know well. And I'm considered an expert in communication. I'm considered an expert in mental health. And I have a decent number, not huge number of close friendships and close people in my life, right? Like within autistic culture, I'm doing fine. So I really want you to start looking at your life if you think you might be autistic, or even if you're holistic and you're here to support your autistic friends or family, and asking yourself, am I judging this person or am I judging myself based on standards that are just culturally relative? So on that point, I would like to read to you something I wrote about countering holistic values. So I wrote this in response to kind of some fellow therapists who are holistic, really judging autistic people and the language that they write when they're writing up reports on autistic children or autistic adults. Okay, so what I have to say is, with regards to eye contact doesn't make you a better person. It doesn't make you honest or calm or kind. Eye contact isn't culturally consistently polite. So different cultures have different feelings about eye contact. It doesn't indicate mental health or connection. Ask my blind friends who do both those things just fine. Stop chasing my eyes. Socializing with small talk, parties, vaguely, in groups of three or more, or about the weather, in order to ascertain social hierarchy with non consensual touch, is not qualitatively better than connection through parallel interaction or parallel play, info dumping, monologuing, shared interests, time, or art. Policing the normativity of another person's body movements is not psychologically healthy. Stop telling us to move less or more. I can pace, fidget, stare, quote my favorite quotes, be nonverbal, sway, stumble, move my hands, and none of it measures my sanity or my heart. Human development is not a race. The autistic child is no less human because we may take longer to learn to tie our shoes, or get to the restroom on time, or stop crying in public, or speak. We also aren't aliens when we learn to read it too, or hold a multiverse of numbers, or commune with animals. Autistic people aren't particularly awkward. We may be awkward to you, but perception is not definition. There is no morality to awkwardness anyway. It never hurt anyone. How strange that it could be a defining factor in diagnosis. I'd rather an awkward person than a jerk any day. Vocal prosody or intonation does not communication make. A lilt here and there practiced will not make us friends. If I'm calm and my voice is flat, it doesn't take away from the content of my words, and it doesn't mean I'm angry or dead inside. It's only my voice, not my humanity. You'll notice while I'm doing this recording, my voice is relatively flat when I'm not masking. We are blunt and often honest. We ask why, not to challenge, but because we want to know. We pick apart the details because they matter to us, not to criticize you, but because there is something greater than us. Truth, logic, fairness, and justice matter more than being polite. We are sensitive, gloriously and painfully sensitive. We hear electricity, feel weather, notice the corners of the rooms and the whispers outside. Stop telling us to get over what is an incredible way of being. Stop trying to expose us and habituate us into your comfortable decibel range. So, yeah, that's kind of like me just picking out some of the things that allistic people will assume that autistic people need to change in order to be happy, to matter. You'll hear of people in partnerships where one person is allistic and another person is autistic, and the allistic person will really be like, this person never wants to socialize in the way that I do. Okay, well, are you willing to socialize in the way that the autistic person wants to? Are you willing to just sit together in the same room and do your activities of interest, or whatever it may be for that specific autistic person? Maybe it's going and watching a show on Broadway together. But this idea that autistic people need to change is so common for the autistic experience, and it's so easily internalized. In fact, if you think about the pain that an autistic child will go through kind of as soon as they start entering the larger world, and sometimes even at home, it makes sense that many autistic people learn to mask or camouflage their autistic traits, right? Like if if I'm an autistic child and in kindergarten, I'm doing my happy flappy hands, that feels really good. And the teacher's like, you've got to stop doing that. That's distracting the class. And the other kids are like, that's weird. Why are you doing that? That means you're, the R word or something like that. Which, I experienced that kind of thing in school. And you're going to eventually, some of us, not all of us, learn to mask, but many of us will go, okay, I have to shut myself down. I need to figure out how they're doing it so that I can look like I belong to their culture, so that I don't stand out and I don't get made fun of, or I don't get punished, or I don't get, electric shock, whatever, which people do to autistic kids when they don't behave sometimes the way that they want which is horrible. Um, so yeah, common experiences of for autistic kids is like wanting friends and feeling lonely. Sorry, being too sensitive, taking things literally, stimming, um, and staring, being too loud, being having real aversions to certain foods and preferences for certain foods, having really intense special interests, repeating things, having kind of echolalia, being really attached to objects. And when those ways of being are treated as if they're bad, and we even have a whole, you know, treatment, which is actually not, it's not a treatment, it's a way of like kind of torturing, in my opinion, kids into behaving holistically. It's called ABA. um, there Eventually people start to, whether through these horrible experiences or through ABA, minimizing themselves and shutting themselves down, and or putting on an act, the camouflaging and masking, and it causes internal dissonance. It's never easy. It's never going to, autistic people aren't going to just switch and suddenly be, if their internal motivating experience is one of like not being able to, not socializing in a holistic way, it's going to take work for them, and stress and anxiety and over, hyper work to ever be in a place where they can pretend to not be themselves. And that's really what, when we talk about unmasking, I think there's a concept that unmasking is like, take off the mask, like rip it off, and it's it's not that easy. For one thing, I think if you've been doing something for many, many years, it's hard to change sometimes, or to allow yourself to change. And the mask belongs to us. Like, we've put a lot of work into it, and it's not always safe to be unmasked as an autistic person. It's oftentimes not safe, and that is impacted by all the other things that impact oppression, right? So we've talked about intersectionality and how being autistic isn't as safe for some people as it is for others. So autistic people learn to mask, they learn to camouflage, and it's anxiety producing, and it can cause depression, and there can be this sense of, I'll never actually get it right, like I'm always working to try to get it right. So when we talk about unmasking, it's less about ripping that mask off and more about like, how can I be more gentle with myself? How can I give myself more self accommodation? How can I be aware about how I talk about being autistic, so that it's so that it's that I acknowledge my needs rather than just trying to shut down my needs. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about one of the tests that exist around being autistic. Has to do with actually how we pretend not to be autistic. So it's called the CAT-Q, and it's a test that assessors will give you to see if they think you're high masking. And so, like, if you go in to get assessed for autism and you walk in and you've got this smile plastered across your face and you're forcing yourself to make eye contact, and you're complimenting the assessor on their shirt, and you're doing all of these things to try to fit in or please the assessor, some assessors will go, oh, this person might be high masking. And so I'd like to read to you some of the pieces from the CAT-Q, and I'm going to read it to you in a way that if you answer yes, or it feels true for you, the more of those that you hear, the more likely you are that you're a high masking autistic person. When I'm interacting with someone, I deliberately copy their body language or facial expressions. I monitor my body language or facial expressions so that I appear relaxed or friendly. I rarely feel the need to put on an act Oh, sorry, I messed up on that one. It's the opposite. I often feel the need to put on an act in order to get through a social situation. I've developed a script to follow in social situations. I will repeat phrases that I have heard others say in the exact same way that I heard them. I often adjust my body language or facial expressions so that I appear interested in another person, maybe in what they're saying. I often feel like I'm performing rather than being in social interactions. In my own ways of being with other people, I will find myself copying behaviors that I've learned from watching other people interacting. I always think about the impression I make on other people. I need the support of other people in order to socialize. I practice my facial expressions and body language to make sure they look natural. I feel the need to try to make eye contact with other people, even if I don't want to, sometimes by staring at their forehead or their chin, or looking and then looking quickly away. I have to I have to force myself to interact with people when I am in social situations. I have tried to improve my understanding of social skills by watching other people, reading books, or taking courses on how to make friends and influence people. I monitor my body language or facial expressions so that I appear interested by the person I'm interacting with. When in social situations, I try to find ways to avoid interacting with others. So you kind of get a sense that it's like really this dance or this act of trying to really mimic holistic culture and holistic ways of interacting. And I run autistic I run autistic groups, and one of the things that, regardless of what the book, regardless of what the course is about or the group is about, one thing that almost always gets said is that there's a sense of relaxation and safety and relief in being in a group of other autistic people. Autistic people will often still have feelings of not fitting in, even with other autistic people, but there's a lessening, like it's less bad, right? It's less hard, it's easier. And it's interesting because when you talk about, I think like Matt Lowry and some of the other people who talk about autistic culture, they'll talk about how there's certain places that are more autistic, culturally autistically friendly, like places where you're more likely to meet autistic people, like maybe at a comic convention or a nature study, science of nature study walk or something like that. Bookstores, museums. I'm trying to think of other examples, but where places where you're more likely to find autistic people, then you kind of like more autistic culture feeling and a sense of relaxation. Like I know I'm gonna feel pretty good and accepted in a bookstore. That's a place that I can kind of go and be okay if I'm out and about in a city I don't know. So, let's see, what else do we want to talk about? Masking can look like suppressing stems, drinking or doing drugs in order to socialize, scripting, mimicking other people's behavior, smiling even though you don't feel like smiling, people pleasing, not talking, like being quiet purposefully so that you don't make social errors, adding an inflection to your voice, adding exclamation points or emojis to written text, overly apologizing, overly complimenting, forcing eye contact, being overly cheerful or joking. Many comedians are autistic, and like humor is something that we can often find within ourselves that holistic culture often appreciates, although sometimes they don't get our jokes. um, Being the know everything or being the expert can be a way of masking, because it's like, I know everything about the subject, so I can go in and I can talk to people about that. I can socialize with holistic people and be appreciated. Or even dumbing yourself down. Like, there are many autistic people who are super smart and know everything about a subject, but won't share that stuff because in the past they've been told, like, you're a know it all, or, you over talk or you overshare. Let's see, what else did I want to share with you all today? Oh, another thing I wanted to share was some common ways in which adults find out that they're autistic. Um, and I think this is important to like kind of how we tell our story, to know that even if we think how we learned we were autistic is strange, that there's probably somebody else who figured it out that way as well. Common adult identifying stories are having a child, a nephew, a niece, or a cousin, or a neighbor child or a friend's child who's autistic and been diagnosed as autistic, and we say, oh, I'm really a lot like that child, right? Like I have a lot in common with them. Maybe I'm autistic. Many autistic adults will go in for an ADHD assessment, and because like 70% of autistic people are also ADHD, they'll go in for an ADHD assessment, and a good assessor will be aware that they might be autistic and do the test to see that, and then they'll be assessed that way. They'll be found that way. Many autistic people had parents or caregivers who knew they were autistic but never told them because the parents feared that giving them that autistic label would be hurtful to them, or just chose never to tell them for different reasons. Maybe it didn't fit into their cultural beliefs, or they didn't believe it themselves. And a lot of parents won't believe that their kids are autistic because they're autistic or they grew up in autistic families. And so they're like, oh, yeah, my child does that, but that's normal, right? And that's so common, and autism is so genetic. Like I think recently, the most recent numbers are like 90% of autistic people will have an autistic parent or grandparent, or an close ADHD family member. And then another one is burnout. So like autistic adults will be going through burnout and feeling like they either have generalized anxiety disorder or depression or severe depression, and it'll last and last, and they finally are like, is maybe this is something else. And because we're so good at doing research, they'll research and research and research until they hit on autism, and then maybe they'll find a good descriptive list of what autism actually is, or what an internalized presentation of autism is, and they'll be like, oh, this all makes more sense. And then maybe they learn about autistic burnout as well, and then like, wow, this really makes sense. And then the last one is children who are adults who were identified as both being gifted and having low foundational skills. That's a super common story, that instead of being seen as autistic, they were just seen as being gifted, and then having learning disabilities, and which is a lot of what being autistic is. And so those are kind of some of the stories that are common. There are many other ways in which people can realize that they're autistic. Sometimes they'll stumble upon a meme or a post and they're like, that's totally me, and then they the algorithms these days will sometimes find out people are autistic somehow, right? Because they're the things that they like. Maybe they like um, cats and Star Trek and weighted blankets, and the algorithms are like, oh, let me send you some autistic content. So that's kind of funny. Let's see. Oh, I wanted to share this with you. This is something that I wrote, and it's like a way of, again, looking at the way that autistic people do it, but how it's pathologized by holistic culture. I'm going to tell you a little story, and I want you to think about which 4 bad autistic talking styles are in this story. And these are things that, like, if these subjects, if the people in the story were kids, they could possibly be um, put in like a treatment program to change. Okay. At the beach, two artists discuss a deep and interesting subject. One of them is staring out towards the waves and feeling deeply what is being said. The other is pacing back and forth, moving their hands and arms to explain their grand thoughts. So, I hear that story and I'm like, oh, interesting people in a beautiful place. um, but autistic children are often, they often get in trouble for only listening and not talking, or um, staring out away from the person who's talking while they're listening to them, or pacing back and forth in order, like needing to move in order to think or communicate, um, moving their arms and hands while they're talking, right? Or monologuing. All of that is stuff that we really strangely judge autistic children for and want them to change. Before we end for today, I want to talk a little bit about internalized presentation of autism. I think because the externalized presentation of autism, or big behavior autism, is so much represented um, in media, or like the DSM. A lot of the things in the DSM are about how autistic people look to holistic people when their behaviors are bigger. And the DSM diagnosis was like built on studying big behavior autistic white middle class boys. And so people who don't fit into some of those categories often will be missed in the diagnosis process, and often will miss themselves because they're not hearing enough of what autism looks like or it feels like in people like them. So an internalized presentation of autism often has to do with, like, instead of behaving bigly and having meltdowns, it's having panic attacks, internal shutdowns and meltdowns within ourselves, and severe anxiety, negative self talk. So I wanted to read a few of those traits. There's so many internalized autism traits, and that I even have like started keeping a list of them because they're kind of, you hear about them all over the place. Um, and key part of internalized presentation is that oftentimes there's an awareness that children and girls are have been traditionally left out of the diagnosis, like they're not caught as often or seen as often. And in that discussion, there's an implied like white women and girls piece, and because of systems of oppression. And when I think it's really important to be aware of what internalized presentation looks or feels like for people who are gender expansive, trans, black, brown people, non-speaking people, disabled people, all of these groups that, when we talk about intersectionality, how does it look differently? How do parents even raise children differently based on how they may be able to be in the world with big behaviors? And so anyway, that's a whole other discussion, but I think it's worth thinking about. And so I tend to kind of not use the women and girls thing as much, even though I do acknowledge that women and girls are often missed in being identified. But I think if we only talk about the women and girls part, then we miss all the other people, right? All the other ways in which people can show up gender wise. And there are men who have, many men who have internalized presentations of autism as well, and they get missed because it's like, well, no, I'm not that. Or, you know, trans or non-binary people get missed because they're like, oh, I don't have that. I don't present in that way, or I'm not a girl, or etc. So, how we tell our story and how we see ourselves as autistic is highly impacted by the identities that we have. Okay, so some of those internalized traits are having a real need for alone time, difficulty starting conversation, difficulty recognizing social cues, anxiety, depression, talking excessively and knowing a lot about a select number of subjects, the development of personalized rituals or routines in order throughout the day, whether for joy or in order to make it through the day or to do things, fixating on certain activities or objects, having strong food aversions or food preferences, being a deep thinker, a prolific writer or creator in their specific interests or special interests, highly intelligent, seeing things at multiple levels, including their own thinking processes, being existential, analyzing existence, being serious and matter of fact in nature, not oversimplifying, everything is complex, often getting lost in own thoughts or checking out, blank stare, being honest, having real justice sensitivity, so caring about justice and fairness, not having difficulty lying. That can be different culturally as well. Some people have to learn to lie. Most autistic people have a hard time with it internally, finding it difficult to understand manipulation, being easily fooled and conned as a young person, feeling confused and being overwhelmed, feelings of being misplaced or from another planet or being a robot, or a changeling, loneliness, being abused or taken advantage of as a child, but not thinking to tell anyone, or not knowing how to respond to that, surviving overwhelming emotions and senses by escaping into thought or action, escaping regularly through fixations, obsessions, or interests, escaping routinely through imagination, fantasy, and daydreaming, escaping through mental processes, escaping through rhythm of words, philosophy, imaginary friends, imitating people on TV or in movies, making friends with older or younger people, obsessively collecting or organizing objects, escaping by playing the same music or media over and over again, escaping through an imagined relationship. So oftentimes autistic people will have limerence, or actual crushes on people. Numbers and counting might bring ease. Escaping to the bathroom at social events, having a difficult time resting or relaxing with so many thoughts, and really valuing purpose, reason, and logic and curiosity, data. We love information. And like I can just keep going on and on with this. There's such a long list. So that might be it might be a whole other video to do. But we're coming up on time. So that's all that I'm going to share now on like how we tell our autistic story to ourselves and to others, and starting to think about how values might, like the value relativism between autistic values and holistic values might impact how we see ourselves or how we explain ourselves to others. All right, thank you so much. And yeah, thank you. Bye.